The message arrived while Jake was staring at a vending machine that refused to recognize his student credits for the fourth time. The machine blinked at him with passive-aggressive politeness, displaying the message, "Error, human confusion detected." Jake sighed. "You're a snack dispenser," he muttered. "You don't get to judge me." Just as he prepared to shake the machine, an ancient human tradition, his wrist console chimed softly. A new message had arrived. The sender name made him pause. Lyra Varel. Jake blinked twice. That name did not belong to a professor, a student, or anyone he usually spoke to. Lyra was the mother of his classmate, Arlen. More importantly, she was Illyrian. Illyrians looked almost human except for one unmistakable difference. Their ears were long, elegant, and curved slightly backward like thin silver leaves. They were also known for being extremely formal, extremely intelligent, and extremely intimidating to casual human college students who still struggled with vending machines. Jake opened the message. The text was short. Jake, if you are available this evening, please come to my home. I would like to speak with you privately. It is important. There was an address attached. Jake stared at the screen for a long moment. Privately, he murmured. His first thought was that Arlen had somehow gotten into trouble. His second thought was that maybe he had accidentally offended Illyrian culture without realizing it. His third thought involved several dramatic possibilities that mostly ended with Jake apologizing repeatedly while alien diplomats looked disappointed. The vending machine beeped again. Standing confused for too long may indicate malfunction. Jake glared at it. You're the malfunction. Still holding the message open, he leaned against the wall and tried to remember the few times he had actually spoken to Lyra Varel. The encounters had been brief but memorable. Lyra had the calm presence of someone who could silence a crowded room simply by raising an eyebrow. She moved with quiet confidence, and even humans who knew nothing about Illyrian culture could sense the quiet authority around her. And recently, her husband had died. Jake remembered hearing about it a month earlier. The news had spread quickly through the university because Professor Virel had occasionally worked with the engineering department. The man had been respected, brilliant, and strangely friendly towards students. Jake had only spoken to him once. Well, spoken might have been generous. It had mostly involved Jake fixing a cargo drone that refused to cooperate during a demonstration, while Professor Virel watched with amused curiosity. Jake had expected to be paid for the repair. Instead, the professor had simply shaken his hand and said something that Jake still remembered clearly. Honesty is a rare skill, Jake. Do not lose it. At the time, Jake had no idea what that meant. Now he stared at Lyra's message again. Okay, he said quietly. This is probably normal. Maybe she needs help with something technical. His wrist console chimed again, displaying the time. If he left now, he could reach the address in about 30 minutes, using the city's maglev lines. Jake pushed away from the vending machine. Fine, he said. I'll go. The vending machine suddenly released a snack bar with a loud clunk. Jake stared at it suspiciously. You waited until now? The machine displayed a cheerful message. Good decision, detected. Jake took the snack bar slowly. Are you spying on me? The machine did not answer, which Jake considered deeply suspicious. The maglev train carried him across the evening skyline of the city. Outside the window, floating transport lanes glowed softly between towering buildings, while distant cargo ships drifted toward orbital docks like patient whales. Jake tried to relax, but curiosity kept tugging at his thoughts. Why had Lyra contacted him? The address led into one of the older residential districts where many off-world families lived. The architecture changed there. Buildings were smoother, quieter, designed with alien aesthetics in mind. When Jake finally reached the street, the sun was already setting. Lyra's home stood at the end of the walkway, tall and elegant, with curved metallic walls that reflected the fading orange sky. The structure looked less like a house and more like a sculpture someone had accidentally decided to live inside. Jake stood outside the door for a moment. This is fine, he whispered to himself. He adjusted his jacket, suddenly very aware that he looked like exactly what he was. A slightly nervous college student with messy hair and questionable fashion choices. Then he pressed the door panel. The entrance opened silently. Lyra stood inside. She wore a simple dark garment that fell smoothly to her knees, and the soft light of the hallway highlighted her pale skin and the long Illyrian ears that curved gracefully behind her hair. Despite the calm expression on her face, there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. "Jake," she said gently. Her voice was calm, almost musical. Jake nodded awkwardly. "Hello, Mrs. Varel." She studied him for a moment, as if confirming something. Then she stepped aside. "Please come in." Jake walked inside, glancing around the softly lit interior. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. He had just opened his mouth to ask why she had called him, when he heard the soft click of the door closing behind him. Another click followed. Jake slowly turned. Lyra had locked the door. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Jake's brain immediately began inventing wildly incorrect explanations. Lyra turned back toward him, calm and composed. "We need to talk," she said. Jake nodded slowly. "Yes," he said. Then he paused. "Should I be worried?" Lyra did not answer Jake's question immediately. She simply looked at him for a moment, her calm gaze studying his expression the way a scientist might examine a curious specimen that had unexpectedly wandered into the laboratory. Jake instantly regretted asking the question. When someone locked the door and then paused to study you silently, the correct response was probably not, "Should I be worried?" Lyra finally tilted her head slightly. Her long Illyrian ears shifted with the movement in a way that was oddly graceful. "No," she said calmly. "You should not be worried." Jake exhaled with visible relief. "Good," he said. "Because if this is the part where you reveal I've accidentally broken some ancient alien law, I'd like to say in advance that it was probably a misunderstanding." Lyra's expression remained serious for a moment longer. Then very faintly she smiled. "I appreciate your honesty," she said. "But no, you are not in legal trouble." Jake relaxed slightly. "That's already the best news I've received today." Lyra gestured toward a wide room beyond the hallway. "Please sit." Jake followed her into the living area. The room was spacious and quiet, illuminated by soft light panels embedded in the curved walls. Several floating displays hovered near the ceiling, showing quiet streams of alien text and environmental readings. A large transparent window overlooked the city below. Cargo ships glided slowly through the evening sky, their engines glowing softly in the distance. Jake sat carefully on one of the chairs. The chair adjusted automatically to his posture with a faint mechanical hum. Jake blinked. "Your furniture is smarter than my entire dorm building." Lyra took the seat across from him. "That is not a difficult accomplishment," she replied calmly. Jake paused. "You've seen my dorm building?" "Yes." "That explains the judgment in your voice." For a moment the tension in the room eased. Lyra folded her hands together, her posture composed but not rigid. When she finally spoke again, her voice was steady. "My husband spoke about you before he died." Jake froze. The humor in the room evaporated instantly. Jake shifted awkwardly. "I'm sorry about what happened to him." Lyra nodded once. "So am I." Her gaze drifted briefly toward the far wall, where a holographic image flickered softly above a low table. Jake hadn't noticed it at first. The projection showed Professor Varel. The man stood beside a cargo drone in the recording, smiling as if he had just told a quiet joke. Jake recognized the moment immediately. "That was the engineering lab demonstration," Jake said quietly. "Yes," Lyra replied. She looked back at him. "My husband told me that was the moment he decided he trusted you." Jake blinked. "That's a surprisingly important conclusion for a drone repair." Lyra tilted her head slightly. "He explained that most people who tried to help him that day asked first how much they would be paid." Jake rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't ask because the drone was about to fall on someone." "Yes," Lyra said. "That was a factor." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable, but it carried a certain weight. Jake shifted in his chair. "So, he told you about that?" "He did." Lyra leaned back slightly, studying him again. "He said something else as well." Jake suddenly felt nervous again. "That sounds like the part where things become complicated." Lyra did not disagree. "My husband believed that integrity matters more than intelligence." Jake considered that. That's good, he said, because I'm still working on the intelligence part. Lyra's lips curved faintly again. You are more intelligent than you think. Jake pointed toward the hovering displays above them. I currently live in a room where the microwave has defeated me 3 times this week. That may be a problem of design, Jake nodded thoughtfully. I choose to believe that. Lyra reached toward the low table beside her and activated a small device. A thin holographic panel appeared between them, displaying rows of elegant alien symbols. Jake stared at it. That looks like legal documents. It is. Jake leaned back slowly. Okay, he pointed at the glowing text. I feel like I should warn you that anything involving alien legal systems probably requires at least 2 lawyers and a translator. Lyra remained calm. This is why I asked you here privately. Jake blinked. That sentence did not reduce my anxiety. Lyra rested her hands again. There is something about Illyrian culture you do not know. Jake raised one eyebrow. I know several things about Illyrian culture. Lyra waited. Jake counted on his fingers. Your species values honor, your ships are extremely advanced, and your tea is strong enough to dissolve small metal tools. Lyra nodded slowly. All correct. Jake lowered his hand. I'm proud of that last one. Then Lyra spoke again. In Illyrian society, when a husband dies, the widow must remarry within 1 planetary year. Jake stared at her. What? Lyra did not appear amused. If she does not, the family estate can legally be transferred to other relatives or governing authorities. Jake leaned forward. That seems extremely unfair. It is very old law. Jake shook his head. So you're saying... He stopped suddenly. Then he looked at the holographic document again. Then back at Lyra. Then back at the document. Oh no, Jake said quietly. Lyra waited. Jake pointed slowly at the glowing text. Please tell me that document is not what I think it is. Lyra's voice remained calm. It is a legal marriage contract. Jake blinked several times. Then he leaned back and looked toward the ceiling. I knew the vending machine was judging me today. Jake continued staring at the floating document as if it might suddenly apologize and disappear. It did neither. The glowing Illyrian symbols floated calmly in the air between them, arranged in elegant lines that probably meant something extremely serious. Jake leaned forward slightly and squinted at the display, as if trying to intimidate it into becoming less official. Okay, he said slowly. Before we go any further, I would like to clarify something very important. Lyra waited patiently. Jake pointed at the hologram. That is definitely a marriage contract. Yes. And you showed it to me. Yes. And the door is locked. Yes. Jake leaned back in his chair and covered his face with both hands. I feel like these events are connected. Lyra remained completely calm. They are. Jake lowered his hands and looked at her again. Mrs. Varel. Lyra, I am just a university student. My biggest legal responsibility so far has been returning library books before the late fee becomes emotionally painful. Lyra's expression softened slightly. I am aware. That sentence does not comfort me. Jake leaned forward again and gestured toward the floating text. So let me ask a question that feels extremely important right now. Lyra nodded. Of course. Jake took a breath. Why me? Lyra did not answer immediately. Instead, she studied him again, that same quiet, careful observation she had shown since he arrived. Jake resisted the sudden urge to check behind him in case someone more qualified had secretly entered the room. Finally, Lyra spoke. My husband trusted you. Jake sighed. Yes, we have established that he was very optimistic. Lyra ignored the comment. He believed that if something happened to him, you would be one of the few people who would treat this situation with honesty. Jake scratched his head. I repaired one drone. You refused payment. Jake shrugged. It was broken. Yes. Jake spread his hands. I'm still struggling to see how that leads to marriage paperwork. Lyra leaned slightly forward now, her voice calm but more serious. Many Illyrian men have already approached me. Jake nodded slowly. That part makes sense. They offered marriage proposals. Jake nodded again. That also makes sense, Lyra continued. Each proposal included conditions. Jake tilted his head. Conditions? Control of family holdings, political influence, financial authority. Jake winced. Oh, yes. Lyra glanced briefly at the holographic image of her late husband on the far wall before looking back at Jake. They were not interested in protecting my children. Jake followed her gaze for a moment. The recorded image of Professor Varel stood beside the cargo drone, frozen in mid-conversation with someone outside the frame. Jake suddenly felt the weight of the situation more clearly. So, Jake said slowly, those men wanted the estate. Yes. And if you refuse them? Lyra's tone remained steady. They will wait. Jake frowned. For what? For the year to end. Jake leaned back again. And then the law takes everything. Yes. Jake exhaled slowly. That's a terrible system. Lyra tilted her head slightly. It was designed centuries ago to prevent unstable leadership. Jake pointed toward the hologram. Your husband seems stable. He was. Jake crossed his arms. So now you're expected to replace him like someone upgrading a navigation computer. Lyra considered that phrasing. That is a simplified description. Jake shook his head. This is ridiculous. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Jake looked back at the floating contract again. And your solution, he said carefully, is to marry a human college student who still forgets to do laundry. Lyra's voice remained calm. You are not ambitious. Jake blinked. That may be the strangest compliment I have ever received. You have no interest in my wealth. That part is accurate, Jake admitted. Mostly because I didn't know you had wealth. Lyra nodded. And you are unlikely to attempt controlling my family. Jake spread his hands. I can barely control my refrigerator. Lyra's expression softened again, almost amused. Exactly. Jake stared at her. So your reasoning is that I'm harmless. I would say trustworthy. That feels slightly better. Jake leaned forward again and tapped one of the glowing lines of text. The hologram reacted instantly, expanding into a larger panel filled with complex Illyrian script. Jake jerked his hand back. Whoa. Lyra calmly reached forward and closed the expanded section. The contract is interactive. Jake nodded slowly. Of course it is. He looked at her again. Out of curiosity, what exactly would my role be in this arrangement? Lyra answered immediately. Legal partner. That sounds suspiciously official. You would publicly represent the household as my husband. Jake stared at her. And privately, Lyra folded her hands. Privately, you would continue your studies. Jake blinked. That's it? That is the agreement. Jake looked around the room as if expecting hidden cameras. This feels like a test. Lyra waited. Jake leaned closer. Are you secretly part of some social experiment about human decision-making? No. Are there aliens watching this conversation right now? No. Jake looked toward the ceiling. If there are, please blink the lights twice. The lights remained steady. Jake nodded slowly. Good. I already have enough problems. Lyra watched him for a moment longer before speaking again. My husband said something else before he died. Jake sighed quietly. I'm starting to feel like he planned this. Lyra almost smiled. He said that if I ever needed someone who would tell me the truth, I should find you. Jake rubbed his forehead. That man clearly overestimated me. Lyra shook her head gently. No. Jake looked up. You underestimate yourself. Jake leaned back again, staring at the glowing contract floating silently between them. Well, he said slowly, this is definitely more complicated than fixing a drone. Jake leaned back in the chair and stared at the hovering contract as if it might suddenly grow teeth. For several seconds, the room remained quiet except for the soft hum of the house systems. Outside the large window, a cargo ship slowly crossed the skyline, its engines glowing like distant blue stars. Jake finally rubbed his face with both hands. Okay, he said slowly. Let me organize my thoughts. Lyra waited. Jake raised one finger. Point 1. I arrived here tonight expecting maybe a technical problem, perhaps a broken household drone, maybe a malfunctioning environmental control system. Lyra said nothing. Jake raised a second finger. Point 2. Instead, I have been presented with a legally binding alien marriage contract. Yes. Jake raised a third finger. Point 3. I am 21 years old and still sometimes forget where I put my shoes. Lyra considered that information. That may not be legally relevant. Jake sighed. It feels relevant. He leaned forward again, looking at the glowing text with cautious suspicion. You understand why this is slightly overwhelming, right? Lyra nodded calmly. I do. Jake studied her face carefully now. Despite her calm tone, there was something else beneath it. Fatigue, perhaps, or pressure. You're serious about this, he said quietly. Yes. Jake looked back at the contract. And if you don't remarry within the year, the estate can legally be transferred to relatives who are already waiting. Yes. Jake leaned back again, exhaling slowly. Your culture really likes dramatic problems. Lyra tilted her head. Human cultures also contain dramatic problems. Jake considered that. Fair. He looked around the room again. The house was beautiful but strangely quiet. Too quiet for a place where a family lived. Where are your children? He asked. Lyra glanced toward the upper level of the house. Asleep. Jake nodded. That's good. I feel like explaining this situation to them right now would be extremely awkward. Lyra almost smiled again. Jake shifted in his chair. So let's say I consider this. Lyra remained still. Jake pointed at the contract again. What exactly happens if we sign that? Lyra tapped a small symbol on the holographic panel. The display rearranged itself instantly, revealing a new set of glowing diagrams and legal text. Jake leaned closer. Your technology makes paperwork look like a video game. It is designed for clarity. Jake squinted at the diagrams. I see 3 sections, a timeline, and what appears to be a terrifying number of legal clauses, Lyra explained calmly. The agreement protects the estate and confirms you as legal co-guardian of the household. Jake's head snapped up. Co-guardian? Yes. Jake stared at her. Lyra, I once forgot to water a plant for 2 weeks. The plant survived. That plant was plastic. Lyra paused. That is less encouraging. Jake leaned back again. You see why I'm nervous. Lyra nodded. You would not be responsible for raising them alone. Jake raised an eyebrow. That's good, because my current parenting experience is limited to telling my friend's robot vacuum to stop following me. Lyra studied him for a moment. You use humor when you are uncomfortable. Jake shrugged. It's a survival strategy. He glanced again at the holographic image of Professor Varel on the far wall. The man's recorded figure still stood beside the cargo drone, smiling as if the world had never been complicated. Jake sighed quietly. Your husband seemed like a good man. He was. Jake nodded slowly. And he told you to trust me. Yes. Jake rubbed his forehead again. You know what the strangest part of this is? Lyra waited. I'm not worried about you. Lyra tilted her head slightly. You are not? Jake shook his head. You've been completely honest with me since I arrived. He gestured toward the contract. You could have hidden half of this information, and I probably wouldn't have known. Lyra said nothing. Jake continued. But you didn't. He leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees. You told me exactly what this is. A legal partnership. Yes. No romance requirement. Yes. No secret expectations. Yes. Jake nodded slowly. That's surprisingly refreshing. Lyra watched him carefully now. Jake suddenly pointed at her. But I do have a question. Ask. Jake leaned forward slightly. Why lock the door earlier? Lyra answered immediately. To prevent interruption. Jake nodded slowly. Okay. Then he leaned back and looked toward the ceiling again. But from my perspective, it looked like the beginning of a crime documentary. Lyra raised one eyebrow. I do not intend to commit crimes. That's reassuring. Jake crossed his arms again. You know, if my friends could see me right now, what would they say? Jake thought about it. They would probably assume I joined a secret alien cult. Lyra considered that. This is not a cult. Jake nodded. Good. He paused. Because I'm not great at cult meetings. Lyra remained quiet for a moment before speaking again. You do not have to answer tonight. Jake blinked. I don't? No. She gently closed the holographic contract. The glowing symbols vanished, leaving the room softer and quieter again. You may take time to think. Jake sat there for a moment, surprised by the sudden lack of pressure. Then he slowly nodded. That's, actually very reasonable. Lyra stood and walked toward the window, looking out over the glowing city. Jake watched her for a moment. Then he spoke quietly. But just so you know. Lyra turned slightly. Jake gave a small, uncertain smile. This is definitely the strangest evening of my life. Jake remained seated for a moment after Lyra walked toward the window. The room felt different now. When he had arrived, the house seemed intimidating. Alien architecture, unfamiliar technology, quiet tension in the air. Now it simply felt calm. He watched Lyra standing near the tall, transparent wall, the lights of the city reflecting faintly across the glass. Cargo transports moved slowly through the sky lanes, their engines leaving soft, glowing trails in the distance. Jake leaned back and stretched his arms. Well, he said, I can confidently say that tonight exceeded my expectations. Lyra turned slightly toward him. Your expectations were low? Very low, Jake said. I expected maybe a broken kitchen drone or a Wi-Fi problem. Lyra looked mildly confused. What is Wi-Fi? Jake blinked. You know what, that's actually a refreshing question. He stood up and walked a few steps toward the window, careful not to stand too close. The floor panels adjusted to his movement with a faint mechanical whisper. Jake looked down at them. Your house reacts faster than my university professors? The house monitors structural balance? Lyra said. Jake nodded thoughtfully. My dorm monitors pizza deliveries. For a moment, the quiet humor eased the tension again. Jake looked outside, then glanced at Lyra. You really trust your husband's judgment that much? Yes. Jake scratched the side of his head. That's a lot of responsibility to pass to someone who still argues with vending machines. Lyra looked at him curiously. You argue with machines? They started, Jake said. Lyra studied him for a moment, as if trying to determine whether that was a joke. Jake continued. Earlier today, a snack dispenser told me I was malfunctioning. That seems rude. Exactly. Lyra turned back toward the city again, though Jake noticed the faintest hint of amusement in her expression. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Jake finally broke the silence. Can I ask something slightly awkward? Lyra nodded. Yes. Jake leaned one shoulder against the window frame. If we actually did this, the marriage contract, what would people think? Lyra answered calmly. They would think I remarried. Jake tilted his head. Yes, but they'd also notice that your new husband is a human college student. That is correct. Jake folded his arms. And that wouldn't cause problems? It will cause discussion. Jake nodded slowly. Discussion is a polite word. Lyra glanced at him. Illyrian society values unusual solutions. Jake raised an eyebrow. I'm not sure marrying me qualifies as a solution. Lyra answered without hesitation. It solves the legal problem. Jake opened his mouth to respond, then paused. That is annoyingly logical. Lyra walked back toward the table where the holographic device rested. She didn't activate it this time. Instead, she simply placed her hands lightly on the surface. My husband respected humans, she said quietly. Jake nodded. He seemed like the type. He believed humans were unpredictable in useful ways. Jake smiled faintly. That sounds like a polite way of saying we're chaotic. Yes, Jake sighed. My mother would agree with that description. Lyra looked curious. What would your family say about this arrangement? Jake laughed softly. Oh, that's easy. He raised one finger. My mother would panic. Another finger. My father would ask if I had read the contract carefully. Another finger. My older sister would immediately demand pictures of alien technology. Lyra tilted her head slightly. And what would you say? Jake thought about it for a moment. I'd probably say, I accidentally got involved in an interstellar inheritance crisis. Lyra nodded thoughtfully. That would be accurate. Jake walked slowly back to the chair and sat down again. You know, he said, there's something else I'm curious about. Lyra waited. Jake gestured around the room. This house is impressive. Advanced technology, beautiful design, probably worth more than every building on my campus combined. Lyra said nothing. Jake leaned forward slightly. And yet you still asked a random student for help. Lyra's voice remained steady. You are not random. Jake pointed toward himself. I'm extremely random. Lyra shook her head gently. My husband believed you were reliable. Jake looked down at his hands for a moment. That compliment felt heavier than the earlier jokes. After a moment, he spoke again. Your husband must have been very confident in people. He was. Jake glanced once more at the holographic recording on the far wall. Professor Varel still stood beside the drone, forever caught in that quiet moment of conversation. Jake exhaled slowly. You know what's funny? Lyra looked at him. If he had told me that day that fixing that drone would eventually lead to this situation, Jake gestured vaguely around the room, I probably would have pretended I didn't know how to use a screwdriver. Lyra's expression softened again. I am glad you did not. Jake leaned back. Me too. He looked up at the ceiling for a moment. Then he sighed quietly. You said I don't have to answer tonight. Yes. Jake nodded slowly. That's good. Lyra waited. Jake rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Because deciding whether to become someone's emergency alien husband feels like something I should think about carefully. Jake sat quietly for a while after speaking. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It had the calm weight of a conversation that had already passed through the strangest parts and now drifted slowly into something more thoughtful. Lyra returned to her chair, sitting with the same composed posture she had maintained all evening. The soft lighting of the room reflected faintly along the curve of her long Illyrian ears. Jake noticed something then. Earlier, when he had first arrived, Lyra had seemed almost distant, careful, controlled, carrying the kind of quiet authority that made people stand straighter in her presence. Now she looked tired, not physically tired, something deeper. Jake leaned forward slightly. Can I ask another question? Lyra nodded. You may. Jake hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Why didn't you choose someone from your own people who you actually trust? Lyra answered without hesitation. Because the men who offered their help do not want to protect my family. Jake nodded slowly. They want the estate. Yes. Jake sighed. I really don't like your legal system. It is very old. Jake leaned back again. Old systems tend to be stubborn. Lyra tilted her head slightly. Human systems also have this problem. Jake thought about the university administration office. Yes, he admitted. Very accurate. For a moment, they both sat quietly. Jake suddenly leaned forward again. Wait. Lyra looked at him. You said earlier your husband recommended me. Yes. Jake pointed toward the holographic recording of Professor Varel on the far wall. But did he explain why? Lyra looked at the projection for a moment before answering. He said something very simple. Jake waited. He said that when the drone malfunctioned during the demonstration, everyone panicked except you. Jake frowned slightly. That's not true. Lyra looked at him. I was also panicking, Jake said. I was just panicking quietly. Lyra considered this. That may still be an advantage. Jake scratched the back of his head. Your husband must have had a very optimistic view of humanity. He believed humans were capable of surprising honesty. Jake leaned back in the chair again. That's a lot of faith to put into a species that invented reality television. Lyra did not respond immediately. I do not know what that is. Jake stared at her. You are happier not knowing. Lyra accepted this answer. Jake shifted slightly, stretching his legs. The chair adjusted again with a faint mechanical hum. I have another concern. Lyra waited. Jake gestured toward the upper level of the house. Your children. Lyra's attention sharpened slightly. They are my priority. I can see that, Jake said quickly, but from their perspective, this situation might look very strange. Lyra remained calm. How so? Jake spread his hands. Imagine this. One day everything is normal. Then suddenly your mother announces she has married a human college student who looks like he accidentally walked into the wrong building. Lyra thought about this. That description is somewhat accurate. Jake nodded. I'm just saying it might be confusing. They will ask questions. Jake leaned forward. Children ask terrifyingly direct questions. I am aware. Jake smiled slightly. I once helped babysit my cousin. The first thing she asked me was why my face looked like that. Lyra looked mildly concerned. What did you answer? I told her I lost a fight with gravity. Lyra's lips curved slightly. That seems acceptable. Jake looked around the room again. You know, despite everything, this house actually feels comfortable. Lyra seemed surprised by the observation. Most people find Illyrian homes unusual. Jake shrugged. Maybe, but it feels peaceful. He glanced again at the holographic image of Professor Varel. I think your husband designed it that way. Lyra followed his gaze. Yes. Jake leaned forward slightly. He seemed like the kind of person who built things carefully. He did. Jake nodded slowly. The silence returned again, but this time it carried something different. Less tension, more understanding. After a moment, Jake spoke again. You know what the weirdest part of tonight is? Lyra looked at him. I'm not actually scared of the idea anymore. Lyra tilted her head slightly. You are not. Jake shook his head. I mean, it's still incredibly strange, but the situation itself isn't what worries me. What worries you? Jake sighed. Messing it up. Lyra studied him quietly. Jake continued. If I agreed to this, I'd be responsible for helping protect your family. That's not a small thing. No, Lyra said softly. It is not. Jake looked at the floor for a moment. I've never done anything that important before. Lyra's voice remained calm but firm. My husband believed you could. Jake looked up again. That man really believed in me. Yes. Jake exhaled slowly. Now I feel like I owe him something. Lyra said nothing. Jake leaned back again and stared at the ceiling. You know what's funny? What? If my friends at the university could hear this conversation, they would assume I've been kidnapped by aliens. Lyra blinked once. You were invited. Jake nodded. Yes. Then he paused. But the locked door didn't help. Jake sat quietly for a long time after his last joke faded into the soft hum of the house systems. The city outside the window had grown darker, the sky lanes now glowing with steady streams of distant traffic. Cargo ships drifted slowly between orbital elevators, their lights moving like patient constellations. Lyra had not rushed him once. She simply waited. That alone told Jake more than any speech could have. He finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. His thoughts felt clearer now, like a puzzle that had slowly rearranged itself into something understandable. You know, he said quietly, when I first got your message tonight, I thought this was going to be a very awkward conversation. Lyra tilted her head slightly. And now? Jake looked around the room again. Now he noticed details he had missed before. Small toys near the staircase, a half-finished children's drawing on a digital panel, a soft blanket folded neatly over a chair. This was not just an alien house filled with technology. It was a home. It's still awkward, Jake admitted. Lyra accepted this. But it's not what I expected, he continued. What did you expect? Jake smiled faintly. Something dramatic, something desperate. Lyra remained quiet. Jake gestured toward the room. But you didn't ask for rescue. No. You asked for honesty. Yes. Jake leaned back again, thinking. My whole life, he said slowly, I've been trying to avoid responsibility. Lyra watched him carefully. Not in a bad way, Jake added quickly. Just the normal way. I study, I pass my exams, I occasionally repair machines that insult me. The vending machine. Yes, Jake said. My greatest enemy. Lyra almost smiled again. Jake rubbed the back of his neck. But tonight I realized something. Lyra waited. Jake glanced toward the holographic image of Professor Varel one last time. That man believed I was better than I thought I was. Lyra followed his gaze. He did. Jake nodded slowly. And if someone like that believed it, he exhaled softly. Maybe I should at least try to live up to it. The room grew quiet again. Jake leaned forward and looked directly at Lyra now. So let me make sure I understand everything. Lyra listened. This marriage would protect your children's inheritance. Yes. I wouldn't be expected to replace your husband. No. I would continue studying. Yes. Jake nodded. And the entire arrangement is built on honesty. Yes. Jake leaned back again and folded his arms thoughtfully. Well, he said after a moment, that's already healthier than half the relationships I've seen on campus. Lyra studied him carefully. You are considering it seriously. Jake nodded. I am. He paused. Although I should probably warn you about something. Lyra waited. Jake pointed toward himself. I am still a very ordinary human. Lyra shook her head gently. My husband believed there is no such thing as an ordinary human. Jake thought about that. He clearly never met my roommate. Lyra raised one eyebrow. Jake waved a hand dismissively. Trust me. For a moment, the quiet humor returned again. Then Jake leaned forward slightly, his tone more certain now. When I walked in tonight, he said, I thought you were asking me to solve your problem. Lyra listened. But that's not really what this is. No. Jake shook his head slowly. This is you trusting me with something important. Yes. Jake let that settle for a moment. Then he gave a small nod. Okay. Lyra's attention sharpened slightly. Jake stood up and walked toward the window beside her. The city lights reflected across the glass, surrounding them with a soft glow. He looked out at the distant sky traffic for a moment before speaking again. You know, he said, most people my age are trying to figure out what kind of life they want. Lyra remained silent. Jake smiled faintly. I definitely didn't expect that process to include emergency alien marriage. Lyra said nothing. Jake turned toward her. But if the choice is between letting your children lose their future, he shrugged lightly, or becoming the strangest husband in the history of the university. He extended his hand toward the table behind them, where the holographic device rested. I think I can live with strange. For a moment, Lyra did not move. Then she walked back to the table and activated the device again. The holographic contract appeared once more, glowing softly in the air. Jake stepped beside her. The alien text scrolled slowly across the display, translating into human script beneath it. Jake read quietly for several seconds. Then he looked up. One last question. Lyra waited. Jake pointed at one line near the bottom. This clause says the marriage begins immediately after the contract is confirmed. Yes, Jake sighed. So technically, he scratched his head. If I sign this, I go from college student to alien husband in about 5 seconds. That is correct. Jake stared at the glowing panel. Then he laughed quietly. You know what? Lyra looked at him. This is still not the strangest thing that's happened to me this semester. Jake reached out and pressed the confirmation symbol. The holographic display brightened for a moment as the contract processed. A soft tone echoed through the room. Legal union confirmed. Jake leaned back slightly. Well, he said. Lyra looked at him. Jake gave a small, uncertain smile. I guess I should start thinking of a way to explain this to my parents.